You are listening to the Musical Mind Podcast with your host, Peter Harris.
Hey everybody, Peter Harris here. Thanks for joining us again. This week we're going to have a conversation with author Greg Renoff. Greg, of course, a few years ago wrote the excellent book Van Halen Rising. It was a thoroughly researched book into the early days of Van Halen, a band that does not have as much thorough documentation as other classic rock bands, so it's been a real treat for fans of them and just classic rock metal fans in general. It's been a great success and still talked about a lot to this day. But now Greg has a new book coming out called Ted Templeman, A Platinum Producer's Life in Music. It's bound to be just as thoroughly, researched as his other efforts. And we get together and talk about just the book, his process in researching the book, interviewing Ted, and co-writing it with Ted, and it's really a good conversation. So I think you'll enjoy this, and hopefully you're looking forward to the book as much as I am. Hey, Greg, thanks for calling in. I appreciate you joining us.
Hey, Peter, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
No problem. Long time no see. I want to start off, of course, we're going to be talking about your new Ted Templeman authorized biography coming out. Of course, many of your readers know of your previous book, Van Halen Rising. And you and I have spoken before at length on that book, and you did exhaustive research for that book. I mean, I still comment to people, I'm like, Greg was checking the weather reports to see if it was really a rainy Monday. I mean,
the fact check is true on that. That is true.
Right. But I mean, you want to talk about exhaustive, that's exhaustive. So, but I'm wondering, was it, I hate to say easier, but was it easier this time around because you had access to the primary source?
Yeah, I would say yes and no. I mean, I think one thing that I would say about doing the book with Ted is obviously I had access, as you mentioned, to Ted, so I could email Ted, and we did. That's actually how we started working on the book, was emails back and forth, talking and having a conversation, and then I kind of began to broach the idea of we should do a book, and what do you think, and he eventually, after we had a long conversation about what I envisioned it and how he envisioned it, he said, okay, go ahead. And I think he just thought, well, maybe he'll work on this for a month and get bored and move on to something else, and I never got bored and moved on to anything else. So yes, and then I went out to California numerous times, maybe 3 or 4 times, and spent days with him, sitting with him, interviewing him, asking him questions, listening to songs with him, and doing that whole face-to-face interview session. So in that sense, in terms of gathering the primary core substance, yes, it was easier. What was actually harder, and was actually something that I didn't expect when I started the book, I didn't think about it, was that there was a lot of things about Ted's musical past. So the book, Ted Templeman, Platinum Producer Life in Music, is just, as the title suggests, it's about his musical evolution and basically his lifetime as a musician, and then as a producer and as an executive in the music industry. So what though I didn't see when I first started the book with him was that he was going to take me to a lot of areas of music I didn't know much about, or I knew only the minimal amount of stuff that you would know about. So this would be things like jazz bands that Ted liked as a kid. Ted was a big fan of Stan Kenton, or he would big fan of a lot of the Cuban jazz bands like that, and people like Tito Puente. And so I can go on and on with all these different people that Ted talked about, and I didn't know anything about these artists at all, and so I had to do that research. In addition, go up to the 60s, Ted was a big Moby Grape fan. He loved Buffalo Springfield, and even if it was only going to be a page or two in the book, I still had to kind of go back and familiarize myself with the music to try to understand what he was trying to tell me, because a lot of times he would say things in interview, and I'm actually thinking, okay, if I have to write this up in a book, I have to provide more than just what he's telling me, because he has a certain expectation that I would understand what he's saying. In other words, I was like, oh, I don't really know about this, and we would talk about this, but I had to put that into the book and basically flesh that out to make people, the reader, understand going on. So a lot of that type of legwork that I had to do to go back through, even beyond trying to figure out concerts that Ted went to. Ted saw a lot of live shows. He went to a place, for example, called the Arc, which is a long gone nightclub up in Sausalito, and spent a lot of time going to see bands there. And so I was actually kind of able to kind of figure out what shows Ted saw based on, he would tell me the bill, and I would say, oh yeah, this is the night, and we would kind of go back and we talk more about it. So that type of try to fill in to fill it in so it wasn't all this sort of generalities and vague stuff. So that was the stuff I didn't foresee, is sort of having to kind of basically buttress parts of the book with my own knowledge base to make things understandable to the reader, where it wasn't just like, yeah, I saw Stan Kenton, and then just move on to the next thing. You have to explain, and I'd actually have to go back and ask Ted about that. I'd say, what about Stan Kenton did you like? And he would talk about this and that, and kind of build it out from there. But I had to do my homework, is I guess the thing. That was more challenging.
Yeah, you have to give it a framework and a sense of context to present it to the reader, so it's not just, yeah, I saw Stan Kenton, right? Yeah, that makes sense. So I was going to ask you if you had to do a lot of outside research not involving Ted, but obviously you did. Yeah.
I did. And there was other stuff, there's an interesting story in the book, which I actually haven't talked about very much in any interviews I've done, which is that Ted was actually hijacked along with his bandmates on Halloween 1969. He got on a plane with the Harper's Bazaar guys. He was the group at the time. In Halloween 1969, they were supposed to fly a red eye from LA to San Francisco. And those guys would drive from San Francisco back to Santa Cruz, where they lived, and the plane was hijacked, and they ended up going, unfortunately for them, being diverted to Denver. And it's a pretty amazing, harrowing story. I'll leave it for the book, but needless to say, I spent a lot of time researching that event, talking, because Ted had very distinct, obviously vivid memories from the terror he was in, and all those guys were in, because it was this really scary situation.
Yeah.
A guy with a rifle on a plane threatening to kill the pilot. That's, when you're in the air, that's a scary thing. So there were a lot of newspaper coverage of that, and I wanted to read that to really kind of explain the whole event in a way that would get the timing right in terms of the time of day and where the flight left, the flight numbers, all that kind of stuff that you would want to have in a book like that. But Ted's not going to remember. He didn't remember the flight number. He didn't remember like when the plane exactly landed and stuff like that. So there was a lot of newspaper, trade journal stuff. A lot of times I would dig things up along the way and send a clipping from Billboard to Ted and say, oh, do you remember this? And you go, oh yeah. And then he might tell me a big story about something, but I totally forgot about this, or wow, this is cool. I didn't see this picture in a long time. And this reminds me of this whole other story. So there was basically, I didn't interview him. I transcribed the interviews in preparation for using it in the book. And then I do my homework and kind of go back to him, and then we would talk more about certain things, especially when it became clear that there were certain, obviously there's certain albums that have hits on them, but there were other turning points in Ted's career, records that perhaps didn't sell a ton or maybe have been a little bit forgotten in the big scheme of things. But I have one right here. I'll show, as long as we have it right here, I'll show you this one, which is by Lorraine Ellison. She was a gospel singer, and had a pop hit in the 60s called Stay With Me, and Ted and Don Landy did a record with her in 1972 or so, and this was completely off my radar. I didn't know anything about this record, and having to kind of talk Ted through this and go back and obviously pull out all of the articles I could find about it and the mentions in Billboard or whatever. It didn't sell very well, but it was an instrumental record in sort of Ted trying to explain to me what he was trying to do with his career and at the time, and how he was hoping to, take some chances on some artists that maybe didn't seem that they were going to be necessarily like commercially viable, and that kind of went forward with Ted with a lot of the stuff he did. He took some risks with certain artists and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that's neat. And well, in that time frame, that was still the days when, at times, a record company would let an artist develop and grow, as opposed to later on was just like, well, your first album didn't go platinum, see ya. There was several artists who didn't sell a ton their first couple albums and grew into monumental, legendary acts. But
and that was another thing too that was really cool about doing the book with Ted, is that, to me, Warner Brothers was a label that I bought a lot of records from, but I didn't really have a very deep understanding of the culture of Warner Brothers. And obviously Ted is biased for Warner Brothers. You know, it was the company. There's that aspect of it, but to be, take things broader than that. I mean, Warner Brothers, as Ted observed to you many times, took a chance on a lot of artists and kept a lot of artists on their roster who didn't necessarily sell but have musical talent. So, for example, like a Randy Newman or a Ry Cooder, who didn't sell, many records at all in the 70s, but they obviously had tremendous talent and stayed on the label. And, Ry Cooder went on to have an incredibly successful career. I don't think he ever sold 1 million copies of any single record, but he's obviously recognized as one of the great artists of the late 20th century, blues artists, soundtracks. And then Randy Newman, eventually in the late 70s, eventually has his moment. But, that was all that part of that me getting up to speed about how Warner Brothers looked at things where, they didn't look at an artist necessarily with crass commercial considerations right out of the bat when they first thought about signing one. And of course, they didn't mean they weren't trying to make money, but they had that sense, like you're saying, that they were like, okay, if we could cultivate, basically, put a fine point on it. If the Doobie Brothers sell 10 million records in 1974, we can keep Randy Newman around, and it's fine. His record can sell, 50,000 copies, and that's fine because we have a successful business model. And yet, maybe one day, as Randy Newman did with Short People later in the 70s, he's the one who's going to sell 1 million records.
Right. Yeah. And it's a shame that's not as prevalent anymore. I've got a question about that. He, as an in-house producer for Warner Brothers, did Ted, especially in the beginning, did he have right of refusal for artists? Or was it like, here's your next project?
He actually did to some degree. And there's one story I left out of the book that I won't broach because Ted asked me not to publish the story. But there was someone who was dating a certain very successful artist, and this person was a figure in the music industry, was dating a successful artist, and the gentleman approached him and said, "I want you to produce my girlfriend," and and basically Ted said no, that he didn't want to do it, in part because he recognized that it was sort of a a potential trap situation for him, where if a record bombs, it's like, then he's got like 2 people mad at him instead of 1. He felt in that situation that he just couldn't do justice. It wasn't that if it wasn't a good fit, he wouldn't have done it, but he just didn't feel it was a good fit. So he felt, but he felt, even as a young, this would have been like 74 or something like that, this happened, as a young person in the industry, he felt comfortable saying that. Now, later on, interestingly enough, Ted, and we talk about this a bit in the book, is that later on, he took on a lot of projects that some soundtrack work, for example, that would not have been his first choice to do, but he did it for the good of the company. So something like Lethal Weapon, as much as he liked working with the guys in Honeymoon Suite, on its face, Ted didn't like music soundtracks. He didn't like doing movie stuff. It just wasn't his thing. He just found it just to be an extra level of stuff you had to deal with, basically, rather than just sort of making a record. You had to think about the director and the producer and everything else with the
Sure.
So he did take on some of those things where, maybe in a vacuum he might say, oh, I don't want to do this, but he realized, I'm a guy who can do this. Someone needs to do this, and I can do a good job at this, so I would do it. So he did that stuff. He had fun with Wayne's World too. It wasn't that he didn't enjoy it, but it was not. It wouldn't have been something he quote unquote volunteered to do or went out of his way to do, but I think felt obligated to the company, and then enjoyed working with all the artists he worked with on those Honeymoon Suite, and then the artists he worked with on Wayne's World, like Tia Carrere and stuff like that. He loved working with her.
Right. I never thought about that, but it makes perfect sense. In a standard album, you're trying to manage and cajole and assuage not only the musicians but the record company, but you add in a soundtrack, and then you've got producers and directors and
right.
a bunch of chiefs and not enough Indians. That's that's a good point. Yeah. Did he ever reveal to you any bands that he really wanted to produce but never had an opportunity to?
Oh, sure. There was one. I mean, he never, it never was ever even in the realm of possibility because of the way things were set up. It was the Eagles. I mean, he always talked about how he would have loved to produce the Eagles, how he loved them. That would have been one. He really wished, there's an interesting story in the book, which I will leave for the book, that he really wished he would have been able to produce the second Aerosmith record. And he was actually in line to do that and then bowed out, as discussed in the book. And that was one that was really a hard one for him to take, because he really, really wanted to do a second record with Aerosmith. He felt that he hadn't done his best work necessarily, and that those guys maybe hadn't come up with the best songs, perhaps. With Done with Mirrors, it just didn't work as well as they had all hoped. Even though I think that the record stands up, it wasn't as good as it could have been on All Around. And so that when that didn't happen, that was a big disappointment to Ted, that he couldn't do another Aerosmith record. But yeah, I mean, for sure, he did mention the Eagles, how much he loved that band, and always dreamed about, if he ever had a chance to produce the Eagles, he would have done it, obviously.
Yeah, that's one of those things. Yeah, that if they're a big artist on Atlantic or Geffen is just not, and you're the producer for Warner Brothers, it's just not going to happen unless there's a major switch. Yeah. I'm wondering, because he always had such good sonics. Do you think personally, and I'm sure it did because it's your personal experience, you think his experience in Harper's Bazaar and being a professional musician helped his ability to produce and coax such great harmonies out of like Doobie Brothers and Van Halen? I mean, it had to have.
Yeah, it did, definitely. I mean, I think, let's put aside the harmonies for now. I mean, the sonics, for sure, in writing the book with Ted and working with him on it, he really spent a lot of time explaining to me about how once he joined Harper's Bazaar, it was a cool thing. They had a hit. He enjoyed the camaraderie of the guys in the band, and they went on tour, and they had a very successful 1967. But pretty soon, being on the road and performing, Ted really realized it wasn't his cup of tea. He just wasn't a guy who felt comfortable fronting a band. And in some ways, he was kind of the co-front man of the band, Harper's Bazaar. He had a partner, Dick, who was his basically the guy he used to sing with on stage together. But he just never felt comfortable doing that. And so he much more felt motivated by the studio experience, working in the studio, learning. And he spent a very, I think, he spent a very, very long time working on the craft of engineering, on the craft of producing, by basically apprenticing under people like Lenny Waronker, who was his friend, but also the producer of Harper's Bazaar, Lee Hirschberg, who was the head engineer for Warner Brothers and was someone who's instrumental on the Harper's Bazaar records, did a lot of them. Don Landy, he ended up meeting Don Landy during the Harper's Bazaar days. And so Ted would basically like stay after school, so to speak. The session would be over and someone else would be coming in the studio, and maybe Don would be doing another session, or Lee would be doing another session, or maybe there'd be no session, and they would just stay in the studio. And Ted told me that he and Don would spend time, and Don would show Ted how he mic'd bass drums and how he would get certain other instruments to sound good, just playing around. And so that was definitely one of the reasons why I think Ted was able to make such good sounding records with Don, because he had developed, not the skills of an engineer, but certainly had a familiarity with what it took to make guitar, bass, drums, horn sections, all these things sound good, because Ted became sort of a studio junkie in his own way. He would hang out at the studio when they weren't recording. He would just hang around in the studio. Right. In terms of the musical aspect of it, that's one of the things that the book, I hope, does justice to really show Ted's gift as a musician, going back to when he was a jazz prodigy as a child, but then up and through his time at Harper's Bazaar, working on vocal arrangements, thinking about how to make, for lack of a better term, unique sounding pop songs that they really tried. And, again, I think, some of the stuff probably holds up better than other stuff, and Ted would tell you that himself. But there was a lot of very, kind of adventuresome sort of pop music. For example, even their first hit, which is probably the song everyone knows best by them, is "Feeling Groovy," which was the cover of the Simon and Garfunkel song. Lenny Waronker brought in Leon Russell, who was a member of the Wrecking Crew and later went on to obviously huge success in the 70s as a solo artist, kind of a rock icon of the early 70s. Leon put together a string quartet to give it a Baroque, what would have been called a Baroque rock arrangement. So instead of having horns on the record, like a lot of records at the time had, he had, bassoon, oboe, these other string instruments, a string quartet. And so Ted saw that as well, sort of how to come up with different arrangements, how to bring different instruments into the musical palette. And then between Ted drawing on those own experiences of his own, thinking back to this time as a to Tito Puente records, Ted became someone who used a lot of percussion on Doobie Brothers records, Little Feat records. There's a lot of that because Ted loved percussion from those his days as listening to jazz music, and then from his time in Harper's Bazaar in the studio, and then learning these different ways of sort of putting together these pop songs. I think it was very, very important that Ted had those experiences. Yeah, and it definitely, I think, translated into some great sounding records. I mean, and Ted would give enormous credit, and he does in the book, to Don Landy. That Don Landy was such a incredibly gifted engineer that it became to the point where Ted would just look over at Don during a session, and Don knew exactly what he was thinking. Oh, the bass frequency is off, and he would drop the bass frequency in a certain channel or something like that. I mean, Ted said it was almost like we could read each other's minds. He'd look at me, and then I'd go, "Oh, what did I miss?" And I go, "Oh, I hear it now. I missed." And it's stop the session and say, "Oh yeah, let's do that again," because Ted maybe missed something with the cymbal pattern or something that Don had sort of picked up on, that the drummer was making a mistake, and Ted was distracted and didn't hear it, and Don would hear it and catch it, and Don would just look at Ted, and go, "You hear that?" And away they'd go. So that whole groundwork of Ted's background gave us these great sounding records like Toulouse Street by the Doobie Brothers that Ted and Don worked on, and onward from there.
Yeah, that had been such an invaluable partnership with Don. I mean, just having a right-hand man like that had to have been just such an asset. I mean, to work together so many years, I would think.
They did. I mean, they did more, in many ways, more records than a lot of people know. I mean, that Lorraine Ellison record I just held up, a lot of people don't even know that record exists. And, it's not, if you're into Van Halen, you're not going to want to necessarily pick up Lorraine Ellison and listen to it. But it's a really good sounding record. And that's, again, Don and Ted. So Little Feat, Doobie Brothers, Van Morrison. I mean, just go to, Don worked on some of the Van Morrison stuff with Ted. Go down the line and all the way up to the very, the very end of the last record they worked together on, which was 1984. It was an incredibly fruitful and incredibly successful partnership. I mean, those guys were like a machine for years and years and years. For about a decade plus, they just made hit after hit record.
Did he mention, Ted, was the transition to the digital age of recording smooth for him, or was that friction for him, or did he mention that? Or
it actually was a challenge for him in some ways. I think he bridged it this way, which is that he talked to me about the fact by the mid sort of by 86, 87, Ted was going to the Power Station in New York. Mm-hmm. After he and Don part ways, Don starts working with basically working 5150 full time and stays with Ed and Don, and then Ted gets a new engineer, a gentleman by the name of Jeff Hendrickson, who was a assistant engineer at Power Station, and then had worked on first record he worked on with Ted, I believe, was VOA. Did Done with Mirrors, did the David Lee Roth EP, did the Eat 'Em and Smile, Honeymoon Suite, Bullet Boys. So almost everything Ted did post 1984 or during 1984, that was going to be with Jeff. Now Jeff had, as I mentioned, had been an engineer at the Power Station, had apprenticed under Bob Clearmountain, and when Ted first went to Power Station, if I remember correctly, a lot of that stuff was no longer analog at Power Station, and Ted had to sort of rely a lot more on his engineer, and that's another relationship that worked really well. That Jeff is a really, really incredibly gifted engineer, made some incredible sounding records with Ted, and as Ted mentioned to me, he said, in the old days, which is discussed in the book, there was basically he and Don would trade off mixing. They would take turns mixing, and eventually then they'd sit down together with the board and do like a kind of a bring it together. But Ted took his notes, Don took his notes. They had their own mixes, and then they go song by song and sort of find the happy medium, or sort of one person would convince the other, and they would get the records done that way. But later on, what was happening was that Jeff would be mixing with Ted, watching, talking, or Ted would come back and then listen and then make his suggestions and leave. Basically, but Jeff was the one who had to manipulate the board, because it was as Ted said, it became the amount of time he had to spend as an executive in meetings and other stuff. He couldn't couldn't spend enough time in the studio anymore to sort of keep up with the learning curve.
Sure.
His earlier days where he had more time, he was spending more time in the studio, but as he became one of the top executives in the company, there's much more corporate boardroom time for him. And he obviously still made records, but he wasn't as free to spend 12 hours a day in the studio.
Yeah, mixing a hi-hat, right. Yeah, at some point you have to delegate. Did he give you an opinion on recording in 5150 versus Sunset Sound?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's the whole 1984 chapter is about that. I would leave the book. I'd leave that to the book in some ways, but I will tell you that Ted would want people to know that he was enthusiastic about Ed Van Halen building 5150 and thought it was a great thing for Ed because he was going to be able to have a home studio where he could work on his musical ideas. For Ted, the big shift came for him when it was suggested by Ed and I presume I think pretty clearly Al and then Don was okay with it too, to do the record up there, and that was not something that Ted wanted to do because he had enough experience in the industry to know that home studios have a tendency to have a lot less focused work be done than at a professional studio. And in terms of Ted's thinking of wanting to get the records done quickly, and that was sort of the trademark of their work with Van Halen, and wanted to kind of control the process, knowing that we have to be out of here in 2 weeks because the Stones are coming into Sunset Sound or something like that.
But just tinker, right.
Right. And, Ted also had his first experience in a Hollywood studio, or maybe a second experience in a Hollywood studio was at Sunset Sound, doing songs with Leon Russell and the Wrecking Crew at Sunset Sound. So he'd always loved it, always done good work there. But, to Ted's credit, he didn't put his foot down as a producer and said, no, we're not doing the record here. Absolutely not. He said, okay, you guys, want to give it a shot. Let's give it a shot. And he knew the room sounded good. It was a situation where it sounded different than Sunset Sound. Obviously, if you listen to something like Fair Warning versus 1984, there's obviously a different sound. But it sounds good, and that was because, as Ted would tell you, Don built the studio, and Ed and Don built it, but it was largely Don wired the board and put the speakers in and put the whole thing together. So.
Well, originally 5150 didn't even have a drum room. It was expanded later on.
Right.
But yeah. That may be why, I don't know this for a fact, but that might be why there were so many Simmons drums, like drum pads.
Definitely. That's definitely why.
Yeah.
That's why. Yeah. That was the other sort of more logistical or basic architecture question, which was that there was no room. I think a lot of Van Halen fans know there was no room. You could not have put a full acoustic drum set in the room, mic those drums, and then have enough room for those guys for Mike, Anthony, and Ed just to have baffles between them, basically sound barriers, have a speaker, and there wasn't enough room. And so what they did was actually use electronic drums because then you don't have to mic the drums. So you just could stick them in the corner and just hit them right then. In fact, they actually overdubbed the cymbals later. But it was a very small space. The other thing too that's worth pointing out is that it wasn't finished when Ed and Don suggested it be done. Now I guess that's all a matter of debate whether it was finished. It was finished enough where they could record the record, but there were 2x4s that were exposed. There were wires running everywhere. It was much more like a semi-finished construction project that was, kind of like, it's like, it was sort of like a hot rod you build in your driveway when it's up and running and you can drive it, but you're like, it's not painted. No, it's not on, right? And you're like, yeah, it works. It sounds, it's great on the road. It's great, but that was part of the issue too for Ted. It was unfinished. And there's all sorts of other little things, but I think Ted has been very I don't want to say irked is the right word, but just sort of wanting to set the record straight that he was never against Ed building 5150 and never thought it was a bad idea. He just thought maybe this isn't the place we want to record a record. Right. Let's demo your ideas. Let's rehearse up here or whatever we do. But then let's go down to Sunset Sound and record the record because it provides for stability in terms of what we've done in the past and those types of things.
Well, honestly, from a third person perspective, that makes way more professional sense. Do your demos there and bring them to a real studio to record. I'm a lifelong huge Eddie Van Halen fan, but he definitely gets, he needs one less yes man on a lot of his projects. He definitely needs somebody to be like, no, we need to do this. But
well, and I think that's the other thing too. That's pretty clear from anyone who reads the book will get this. I think Ted can't read Ed's mind, and it was never trying to he's not trying to cast aspersions on him by any stretch of the imagination. It was just more of Ed wanted more control, and he just wasn't going to turn to Ted and say, listen, again, I'm just making this up, but he's not going to turn to Ted and say, I'm going to co-produce the record with you. Move over. It was not that type of situation. It's almost like, and this is sort of a bad metaphor, but hopefully people understand what I'm saying. It's sort of like, it's like the boy who becomes the teenager who starts challenging the authority of the father figure, going, you know what, you think what's right. And there was a lot of that. And I think Ted would be, the first person to say, like, when I first heard the idea for Jump, not the song, the keyboard idea for Jump, I was like, I don't know about this. This doesn't seem like a good idea. But the song came together. He loved the song. He remained uneasy with the idea of that becoming a Van Halen song because it was so different than what came before. But that was all part of the sort of the push and pull of what was going on at the time. And he, give full credit to Ed. He does in the book that Ed had a vision for a different Van Halen. He saw this through. He basically just stood up for himself and said, I think this is good. I want to do this. And those guys said, okay, let's do it. All of them said, let's do it. Let's give it a try. And it came out to be the biggest song of all time. So, that was part of the other thing was going on. It was sort of, I think, wanting to have more, just hands-on control, have your own studio, do your own mixes, these types of things that was not necessarily feasible since it sound easily, where you could just go in your backyard and mix something and put a demo together and really mix it and then work on it and record it the next day with the producer sitting there rather than going to Sunset Sound and doing it. So,
right. And to back up Ted's argument about that, I mean, I'm sure you've heard, and many have heard the original demo Ed played over the phone to Jazz Obrecht, in that like 82 interview, and it's vastly different. I mean, it's a different patch on the keyboards. It's different,
Right. And that's what Ted,
probably
I can't say with 100% certainty, but I'm pretty sure that's pretty close to the way Ted describes it, because he talked a lot about when he was lukewarm on the idea, but Ed, Don, and Al stayed up all night and then re-recorded it. Again, not re-demoed it, but basically cut the parts. Said, okay, let's lay this down, put the keyboard part down, put the drum part down, put it together. And he's heard that and he was like, well, shit, that's good. Actually, that's good. That's good. Still, again, going, do we really want to do this for Van Halen? I don't know. It's just like, I mean, what if people don't, basically what people are like, what happened to my Van Halen? And that, that was true. That was true. And of course, it didn't do anything to their success. I mean, obviously, because I think the vast majority of people who were fans at the time who were maybe uncertain about the whole left turn to Jump, I mean, they didn't abandon the band. They accepted it. I think most people, but there's no question about it that it was something that was very different than what came before.
But and it brought them a lot of new fans, more important.
Right, of course. Yeah, I mean, it made them bigger than they'd ever been before by any stretch of the imagination.
Absolutely. I'm assuming it's also in the book, and I don't want you to give it away, but did he wait on his decision to go with Roth versus Van Halen in '86? Yeah,
I mean, that's something I think if you and anyone else who kind of gets in the book, you'll see that was Ted has a perspective I think most people won't expect him to have on that. I think there's been a lot of, I think from Ted's perspective, a lot of, Ted obviously didn't give a ton of interviews about this. It's like, he's a pretty private person and he never he wasn't out there going to Circus Magazine and giving exclusive interviews about why he did this or that and stuff. Obviously that was never done. But, for him, it was a very difficult chapter for him in his career because he felt, I think, torn by the fact that he felt, a great loyalty to the original lineup, loved the original band. It wasn't so much that he, necessarily, it was any particular one guy in the band, like, oh, this guy is, better than the other, or like, I'm gonna go with Dave. It wasn't like that at all. It was more like he wanted the original band to stick together and just couldn't really reconcile in his mind the idea of someone else stepping into the shoes of Roth or just replacing Roth or whatever you want to do. I think the analogy we used in the book was, it's sort of like if Roger Daltrey joined the Rolling Stones in '86, you could be like, that's the guy who could do it. I mean, he's got, he's the big enough profile. He's got the songs, he's got the stations thing, but it's not the Rolling Stones. Roger Daltrey fronting the Stones, and I think that's the way Ted saw it. It wasn't a knock on Sammy, and it wasn't a knock on Ed. It was more that he wanted the original lineup to stay together, and that was just not. It's not feasible. And obviously, it wasn't gonna, just wasn't gonna happen. But that was what tore him up, because he respects Sammy enormously. I mean, obviously, he made records with him, like made some record with him in '73, the BOA, and right, and so it was Paper Money. It was never an issue of not thinking like Sammy's a great singer or Sammy's a good talent. It just felt like it was the wrong. You couldn't make it Van Halen. That was his opinion, and I'm sure he's well aware. We don't want to talk about this, but he's aware of other groups that did these types of changes and then kept the name of the band and all that stuff and went forward. So it's not, Ted's aware of that. But for him, that was where it sort of became a difficult thing, and then it just became, kind of unworkable and so far that it wasn't. Ted just couldn't reconcile with it, and those guys were probably, I think in all fairness to everyone involved, I'm sure there were bruised feelings on the other side too, with the band members thinking like, what's with this guy? He produced, it's Don, it's me. It was sort of like a no-brainer for him to be the guy to kind of continue, because it's just basically Sammy. He'd worked with Sammy before, but yeah. And so he went with Roth because he had produced Roth before. Obviously, he'd done every recording ever with Roth before, but it wasn't. I think Ted kind of would reject the construction of the idea that I chose Dave over that. I mean, he wanted to choose Van Halen. He wanted to choose the original band, and that's what he tried his best to do. I mean, I think that was to put it back together. And I think that but obviously no one was going to budge. Dave wasn't going to budge, and the other guys weren't going to budge back, and that was the end of that.
Yeah, just an unfortunate situation. Talk about you now. You've written 3 books now. How much for you pre-production and research time is there versus the actual writing? Have you thought about it?
There's a lot. I mean, there's probably it's probably, whenever I'm doing research, I'm writing all along. I'm taking notes. I'm putting things together. I'm basically slapping. I find a quote that Ted said to me in an interview, and I'd slap it into a chapter 6 document. And I'm sort of starting to firm it up. But really, it's pretty much a 50-50 process. I mean, there's I never really. I'd have to go back and actually kind of look maybe to sort of see where I was at with certain drafts of chapters and when I was done with it. But it takes a long time to do these books. For me, I mean, other people maybe could do them faster. For me, and my abilities to do them, because unless I really feel like I understand the landscape of a certain period of time and understand the personalities involved, and then understand how that fits into the larger narrative, I can't do much writing, because it ends up just being stuff that you have to change later anyway. So in other words, when I would write parts of the book, I drafted the Van Halen chapters, which there are 3 of them in sequence in the book, which, again, was part of the thinking about the book. How do you put it together where it has narrative flow? There's 3 of them in a row. So I might have written them together and then go back and then work more on the Doobie Brothers. So it wasn't necessarily that I was like marching through the book chapter by chapter, but it would be, it's like, okay, I'm in the Doobie Brothers space here. I'm going to write the stuff about the Doobie Brothers. Then write the Van Halen stuff, write the Little Feat stuff. And that was kind of how, and some of that fell into chapters, but sometimes it would flow over chapter boundaries more than one. And so there was, a lot of work for me, as I already mentioned, to think about sequence of singles that were put out, chart performance. I mean, that was, unless you're Forrest Gump, no one's going to remember every single chart performance of every single. And so Ted, but obviously, certain songs went to number 1 or the top 10. But I had to go back and look, the second single from the 3rd Doobie Brothers record, where did it go? When did it do this? And sort of that all took a lot of, it's a lot of time to kind of go back. And, and a lot of times, I'm not saying any breaking news to anybody in the world, but the Wikipedia was, often way wrong about when records were released and like months and months off. And you're like, oh shit, you look at Billboard and they have records out, the records charted, and if someone has made a mistake on Wikipedia, and so to kind of have to go through and, for lack of a better term, like fact check all of the facts. I mean, that was me. I mean, there's no other researcher that was me. It was just going through, and so, I really wanted as I meant, the backbone of the book in terms of the buttress stuff that I would do to sort of support the stories that Ted was telling were on point. So that took a lot of time.
Yeah, I bet. Do you personally tend to have to go back and look at sections once you're getting it all together? Are you just like, I've got to rewrite this whole thing? Or can you basically, once you're about 75% done, can you basically just do some editing?
There are going to be some chapters that are much more painful to write than others. I mean, it just is. I mean, especially when you're trying to capture nuanced perspectives. So, for the 51, the chapter about the making 1984, for example, I've drafted that a number of times because Ted really wanted to be fair, and Ted is a fair-minded person, and I think he wanted to be fair to all people involved, and so it took a lot of time to sort of dial that in terms of, again, not that there were like, anything that was untoward of anyone in there, but really trying to like make sure that we're giving, for example, being sympathetic to Ed Van Halen in the way that Ted was trying to be sympathetic, saying, things happened that might have pissed me off. Things happened, I'm sure, that he was very pissed off about the time, but that's for him to say. But basically, to basically say like, hey, I'm, meaning Ted, I wasn't perfect. I might have made mistakes. I maybe could have done things differently, and sort of just to be fair to people, because I think that was important to Ted to sort of have it be something where no one was going to read. I mean, people may read it, obviously, anytime you write a book, I would say somebody's going to get mad about something, but, basically to try to be, fair to people in situations where it's collaborative work, and, there are obviously things where sometimes people had bad intentions, but not in the case of the making 1984. It wasn't anyone had quote unquote bad intentions. It's just sort of the circumstances went the way they went. And so to try to dial that stuff in, that took a long time. Other chapters, for whatever reason, were easier to write. And then I sat with Ted, and we in his condo, and we went through them basically. I would talk them through basically part like, okay, we kind of like turn to this page, we look at this, and I'd be like, here's what we have here, and he'd be like, well, wait a minute, that's I don't know, I don't know if I would want to say it that way, and we kind of go back. I'll go, okay, I'm thinking, well, I thought I'd captured what he had told me earlier in writing it up in the book, but maybe I'd missed something, and he'd sort of explain, and we'd have to kind of take notes. And then I would go back and sort of retweak that and kind of go through. So there was a lot of that. So that whole aspect of it too. And I think this is my first experience writing a book with another person. So right. There are obviously people who maybe have done this numerous times before as, a ghostwriter or whatever, or whatever the phrase would be. Ted, Ted and I were or Ted at least was upfront with the fact that he didn't want it to be like a ghost written book where it's like, like the idea that like, the person like types it themselves. That was Ted always felt that felt phony and wanted me to be basically upfront with the fact that I authored the book with him. But, I'm going to guess that's almost always, if the person is involved, I mean, the subject of the book is actually involved in the book in some sort of significant way. There's always going to be that where the person goes, this isn't right, or, oh, okay. Come to think of it. Yeah, you put it, the way you put it there is actually clearer than I probably explained it to you the first time. I said, yeah, I sort of figured out what you were trying to say. And that's the other thing too. Sometimes it was just a matter of when you transcribe an interview, you mishear things. I mean, actually that happened. I don't remember what particular part of the book, but he was like, yeah, I had related a story in the book, and I told it to him, and we were sitting together, and he's like, that's not right. And I was like, yeah, this is, you told me. He's like, no. And I for whatever reason, I missed something, how he said it, or the way I typed it up from the oral interview I did with him, the interview, when I would record it and then type it up, I missed something, and it was not a big thing, but to him it was like, it was something he knew. I'm going to guess that maybe 99.9% of the people who read the book wouldn't have picked up on, but he knew it was like off because it wasn't capturing the way he felt. Sure. It was just something I'd missed. So there was a lot of, again, a lot of that when you're writing a book as the sole person, Van Halen Rising, I'm writing it myself. You don't have to answer. You have to answer your editor, the press, but you don't have to answer to another human being to say, is this accurately portraying your on this topic, where they can kind of turn around and go yes or no, not really. Wait a minute, we got to rework this. And there was definitely some stuff like that happened, and but that was what makes for a better book, because it's not just sort of like Ted talking to me, and then 3 years later I emerge with this book, and Ted's like, what. We're just, it was a collaborative process all along, is what I'm trying to say.
Right, that's great. Yeah, and I want to make sure the people listening who are thinking about buying the book, a lot of people know the Van Halen, the Doobie Brothers aspect, but I mean, I'm gonna just throw out some names here that I know. I mean, just what a monumental footprint he's had on music. People really should check out this book, because he's just, I mean, the Doobie Brothers, Van Halen, I mean, Nicolette Larson, Alan Holdsworth, Van Morrison, Captain Beefheart, Montrose, Cheap Trick, Atomic Playboys with Steve Stevens, Bette Midler. I mean, just a lot. I mean, a diverse group of people.
Joan Jett. He did a couple sessions with Joan Jett. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned Honeymoon Suite. I mean, there's a lot of groups that he's worked with that may not be on top of people's heads. So if people are even, thinking about the book, I mean, I would say like he's got a big territory that he's covered and a big impact on the music scene. And, I'm looking forward to reading it. I think he has, like I said, a big footprint on the music industry. So.
Yeah. I mean, even like for me, again, that was something else we kind of touched on at the beginning of the interview, was about, I knew he did Nicolette Larson,
right?
But I had to kind of, he was extremely proud of his work with Nicolette Larson, because Nicolette is one of the three, I mean, there, maybe more, but at least the three prominent acts you can think of that Ted, it's kind of a loaded term, but in effect discovered, basically that he was the one who basically said, okay, I want to put, I think these individuals are worthy of a Warner Brothers record deal, and helped get them a Warner Brothers record deal. He signed Nicolette, he in effect signed Van Halen, and then was, he pulled the Doobie Brothers demo out of the box there, listened to it, and got the guys at Warner Brothers to sign the Doobies. But for someone like Nicolette, I mean, I didn't really, I just knew like a lot of love, but I had to really, because were important records, because those were big hits for Ted, and it was a chance for him to do something where he and Nicolette had a sort of a musical, a similar musical mind, where they were willing to do a lot of different styles of music, ragtime, a lot of different things that would never have, necessarily worked with some of his other acts. And she was, Motown, a lot of stuff that she really, had a very, very broad talent. And so that was a cool thing for Ted to have her go from being a background singer. He gets tipped off to her from Linda Ronstadt. Linda Ronstadt was the one who called him up and said, I got a girl for you. You're going to love this girl. She's a great singer, and you should think about working with her. And from there to her going to the top 5 or top 10 or whatever, she had a lot of love, and being a, million seller. That was a big thing for Ted. And he was very proud of those records he did with her.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. She had just the right amount of tinge of rasp in her voice. It was still clear, but it was just enough. Yeah. Now, let's go over, before I let you go, I want to make sure that everybody knows, your sites, where to go to order the book, where they can buy it physically, et cetera, where they can get their hands on it.
Yeah. So there's as we mentioned earlier, it's like, it's coronavirus world, so everything has changed. Well, the book is, now being shipped from Barnes and Noble. I'm going to have a site that's going to be up in a couple of, maybe a week. It'll be up. It'll be live. It's for signed books from me. And there was a whole very well orchestrated media campaign or whatever, promotional campaign that was going to be amazing for me and for other people who are going to see this, is that Ted was going to do some book events on the West Coast. Obviously, I'm in Oklahoma. Ted's hunkered down on the West Coast, so that's not happening. So that was, and we're also going to sign some books that week. And so until we get in the same room, it's just the logistics are just too difficult with trying to, personalize books for people and just be like ship. It's too, can't leave your house. It's just crazy. So we'll hold off on sort of the co-signed books. Hopefully we'll be able to get those done. But I'll have a site running. I'll put it up on Twitter and Facebook. That should be in the next week or so. Like I said, it's supposed to be up by April 21st, but guess what? It'll be up by April 15th, but the book will only be shipping from whatever, but that's fine, or whatever.
A signed copy of Van Halen Rising here somewhere.
There you go. There you go. Yeah, I've signed a ton of books. It's always a thrill for me. I mean, it's really the coolest. One of the cooler parts of doing this is just the idea that anyone would want your signature in a book is just a cool thing. So yeah, there's that.
Is I didn't even ask you to sign my copy. I just ordered it, and when it got here, it just said, "You're a jerk, Greg Renoff." No, I'm just kidding.
That would be the only nasty thing I ever wrote in anyone's book. You'd be the only person. So there you go. So I always have to try to come up with something clever in every book. But yeah, there's that. And then Twitter is @Greg Renoff, GregRenoff. I'm on Facebook. People can find me on Facebook. I still have the Van Halen Rising site running on, which is up, and people can always message me through there. It's sort of been kind of a placeholder for a long time, but it's up there, and you can always send me an email through that as well. And then Facebook /Van Halen Rising is still up, and so whenever I have a couple of Van Halen tidbits related to the TED book, I put them up there. I don't want to lead to 10,000 unlikes from the Facebook page if I do too much, Nicolette Larson or something. People will get all offended. It's not Van Halen, but yeah. So I'll do stuff. Yeah, whatever. Yeah. I mean, I'm on Twitter quite a bit, and it's been I think for everybody who's involved in any sort of creative endeavors right now. I mean, I you have to sort of, for me, be very appreciative of the fact that my book is going to get sold. If I was a singer songwriter trying to go out on the road right now, it's no deal. So me losing a couple of, it sucks. I mean, it sucks not to be able to do the book signing with Ted and do a couple of book events we're going to do, which are going to be really cool. And I know he was actually really looking forward to doing them because he really enjoyed the events we did, or in the event we did in Pasadena back in 2015, and was looking forward to just answering questions and just sort of getting out. He doesn't do it very often, but once in a while, he thinks it's cool to sort of meet fans and do the whole kind of talk. He likes to talk about these records because he loves them. So hoping that's going to happen. For people who are waiting, like all of us, I'm really hoping we'll reschedule. Romans was going to happen in April, and obviously that's not happening. So hopefully later in the summer. And there was a couple of other events that we were getting ready to announce, actually, that kind of just got sidelined for the foreseeable future. So we'll see what happens. But,
running soon. Yeah, I think so.
In the book itself, it's going to come out as an ebook. It's going to come out as a paperback, or it's already out as a paperback, as we mentioned, and then it's a Audible book, and it will be I think, in people's hands within a week or two.